Chapters 13 and 14 of Over the Top. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith. Over the Top by Arthur Empey. Chapter 13. My First Official Bath. Right behind our rest billet was a large creek about 10 feet deep and 20 feet across, and it was a habit of the company to avail themselves of an opportunity to take a swim and at the same time thoroughly wash themselves and their underwear when on their own. We were having a spell of hot weather, and these baths to us were a luxury. The Tommies would splash around in the water and then come out and sit in the sun and have what they termed a shirt hunt. At first we tried to drown the cooties, but they also seemed to enjoy the bath. One Sunday morning the whole section was in the creek, and we were having a gay time, when the sergeant major appeared on the scene. He came to the edge of the creek and ordered, "Come out of it! Get your equipment on, drill order, and fall in for bath parade. Look lively, my hearties. You have only got 15 minutes." A howl of indignation from the creek greeted this order, but out we came. Discipline is discipline. We lined up in front of our billet with rifles and bayonets. Why you need rifles and bayonets to take a bath gets me. A full quota of ammunition, and our tin hats. Each man had a piece of soap and a towel. After an 8-kilometer march along a dusty road, with an occasional shell whistling overhead, we arrived at a little squat frame building upon the bank of a creek. Nailed over the door of this building was a large sign which read, "Divisional Baths." In a wooden shed in the rear we could hear a wheezy old engine pumping water. We lined up in front of the baths, soaked with perspiration, and piled our rifles into stacks. A sergeant of the R.A.M.C., with a yellow band around his left arm on which was S.P. for Sanitary Police, in black letters, took charge, ordering us to take off our equipment, unroll our puttees, and unlace boots. Then, starting from the right of the line, he divided us into squads of 15. I happened to be in the first squad. We entered a small room where we were given 5 minutes to undress, then filed into the bathroom. In here there were 15 tubs, barrels sawed in two, half full of water. Each tub contained a piece of laundry soap. The sergeant informed us that we had just 12 minutes in which to take our baths. Soaping ourselves all over, we took turns in rubbing each other's backs, then by means of a garden hose washed the soap off. The water was ice cold, but felt fine. Pretty soon a bell rang and the water was turned off. Some of the slower ones were covered with soap, but this made no difference to the sergeant, who chased us into another room, where we lined up in front of a little window, resembling the box office in a theater, and received clean underwear and towels. From here we went into the room where we had first undressed. 10 minutes was allowed in which to get into our clabber. My pair of drawers came up to my chin, and the shirt barely reached my diaphragm, but they were clean, no strangers on them, and so I was satisfied. At the expiration of the time allotted, we were turned out and finished our dressing on the grass. When all of the company had bathed, it was a case of march back to billets. That march was the most uncongenial one imagined, just cussing and blinding all the way. We were covered with white dust and felt greasy from sweat. The woolen underwear issued was itching like the mischief. After eating our dinner of stew, which had been kept for us, it was now 4 o'clock, we went into the creek and had another bath. If Holy Joe could have heard our remarks about the divisional baths and army red tape, he would have fainted at our wickedness. But Tommy is only human, after all. I just mentioned Holy Joe or the chaplain in an irreverent sort of way, but no offense was meant, as there were some very brave men among them. There are so many instances of heroic deeds performed under fire in rescuing the wounded, that it would take several books to chronicle them, but I have to mention one instance performed by a chaplain, Captain Hall by name, in the brigade on our left, because it particularly appealed to me. A chaplain is not a fighting man. He is recognized as a non-combatant and carries no arms. In a charge or trench raid the soldier gets a feeling of confidence from contact with his rifle, revolver, or bomb he is carrying. He has something to protect himself with, something with which he can inflict harm on the enemy. In other words, he is able to get his own back. But the chaplain is empty-handed, and is at the mercy of the enemy if he encounters them, so it is doubly brave for him to go over the top under fire and bring in wounded. Also, a chaplain is not required by the King's regulations to go over in a charge, but this one did, made 3 trips under the hottest kind of fire, each time returning with a wounded man on his back. On the 3rd trip he received a bullet through his left arm, but never reported the matter to the doctor until late that night. Just spent his time administering to the wants of the wounded, lying on stretchers and waiting to be carried to the rear by ambulances. The chaplains in the British Army are a fine, manly set of men, and are greatly respected by Tommy. Chapter 14. Picks and Shovels. I had not slept long before the sweet voice of the sergeant informed that No. 1 section had clicked for another blinkin' digging party. I smiled to myself with deep satisfaction. I had been promoted from a mere digger to a member of the Suicide Club, and was exempt from all fatigues. Then came the awful shock. The sergeant looked over in my direction and said: "Don't you bomb throwers think that you are wearing top hats out here? According to orders, you have been taken up on the strength of this section, and will have to do your bit with the pick and shovel, same as the rest of us." I put up a howl on my way to get my shovel, but the only thing that resulted was a loss of good humor on my part. We fell in at 8 o'clock, outside of our billets, a sort of masquerade party. I was disguised as a common laborer, had a pick and shovel, and about 100 empty sandbags. The rest, about 200 in all, were equipped likewise: picks, shovels, sandbags, rifles, and ammunition. The party moved out in column of 4s, taking the road leading to the trenches. Several times we had to string out in the ditch to let long columns of limbers, artillery, and supplies get past. The marching under these conditions was necessarily slow. Upon arrival at the entrance to the communication trench, I looked at my illuminated wrist watch. It was 11 o'clock. Before entering this trench, word was passed down the line: "No talking or smoking. Lead off in a single file, covering party first." This covering party consisted of 30 men, armed with rifles, bayonets, bombs, and 2 Lewis machine guns. They were to protect us and guard against a surprise attack while digging in no man's land. The communication trench was about half a mile long, a zigzagging ditch, 8 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Now and again, German shrapnel would whistle overhead and burst in our vicinity. We would crouch against the earthen walls while the shell fragments slapped the ground above us. Once Fritz turned loose with a machine gun, the bullets from which cracked through the air and kicked up the dirt on the top, scattering sand and pebbles, which, hitting our steel helmets, sounded like hailstones. Upon arrival in the fire trench, an officer of the Royal Engineers gave us our instructions and acted as guide. We were to dig an advanced trench 200 yards from the Germans. The trenches at this point were 600 yards apart. 2 winding lanes 5 feet wide had been cut through our barbed wire for the passage of the diggers. From these lanes white tape had been laid on the ground to the point where we were to commence work. This in order that we would not get lost in the darkness. The proposed trench was also laid out with tape. The covering party went out first. After a short wait, 2 scouts came back with information that the working party was to follow and carry on with their work. In extended order, 2 yards apart, we noiselessly crept across no man's land. It was nervous work. Every minute we expected a machine gun to open fire on us. Stray bullets cracked around us, or a ricochet sang overhead. Arriving at the taped diagram of the trench, rifles slung around our shoulders, we lost no time in getting to work. We dug as quietly as possible, but every now and then the noise of a pick or shovel striking a stone would send the cold shivers down our backs. Under our breaths we heartily cursed the offending Tommy. At intervals a star shell would go up from the German lines and we would remain motionless until the glare of its white light died out. When the trench had reached a depth of 2 feet, we felt safer because it would afford us cover in case we were discovered and fired on. The digging had been in progress about 2 hours when suddenly, hell seemed to break loose in the form of machine gun and rifle fire. We dropped down on our bellies in the shallow trench, bullets knocking up the ground and snapping in the air. Then the shrapnel batted in. The music was hot and Tommy danced. The covering party was having a rough time of it. They had no cover, just had to take their medicine. Word was passed down the line to beat it for our trenches. We needed no urging. Grabbing our tools and stooping low, we legged it across no man's land. The covering party got away to a poor start, but beat us in. They must have had wings because we lowered the record. Panting and out of breath, we tumbled into our front line trench. I tore my hands getting through our wire, but at the time didn't notice it. My journey was too urgent. When the roll was called, we found we had gotten it in the nose for 63 casualties. Our artillery put a barrage on Fritz's front line and communication trenches, and their machine gun and rifle fire suddenly ceased. Upon the cessation of this fire, stretcher bearers went out to look for killed and wounded. Next day we learned that 21 of our men had been killed and 37 wounded. 5 men were missing, lost in the darkness. They must have wandered over into the German lines, where they were either killed or captured. Speaking of stretcher bearers and wounded, it is very hard for the average civilian to comprehend the enormous cost of taking care of wounded and the war in general. He or she gets so accustomed to seeing billions of dollars in print that the significance of the amount is passed over without thought. From an official statement published in one of the London papers, it is stated that it cost between £6,000 and £7,000, or $30,000 to $35,000, to kill or wound a soldier. This result was attained by taking the cost of the war to date and dividing it by the killed and wounded. It may seem heartless and inhuman, but it is a fact, nevertheless, that from a military standpoint it is better for a man to be killed than wounded. If a man is killed, he is buried and the responsibility of the government ceases, excepting for the fact that his people receive a pension. But if a man is wounded, it takes 3 men from the firing line, the wounded man and 2 men to carry him to the rear, to the advanced first aid post. Here he is attended by a doctor, perhaps assisted by 2 RAMC men. Then he is put into a motor ambulance, manned by a crew of 2 or 3. At the field hospital, where he generally goes under an anesthetic, either to have his wounds cleaned or to be operated on, he requires the services of about 3 to 5 persons. From this point another ambulance ride impresses more men in his service, and then at the ambulance train another corps of doctors, RAMC men, Red Cross nurses, and the train's crew. From the train he enters the base hospital or casualty clearing station, where a good-sized corps of doctors, nurses, etc., are kept busy. Another ambulance journey is next in order, this time to the hospital ship. He crosses the Channel, arrives in Blighty, more ambulances, and perhaps a ride for 5 hours on an English Red Cross train with his crew of Red Cross workers, and at last he reaches the hospital. Generally he stays from 2 to 6 months, or longer, in this hospital. From here he is sent to a convalescent home for 6 weeks. If by wounds he is unfitted for further service, he is discharged, given a pension, or committed to a soldiers' home for the rest of his life, and still the expense piles up. When you realize that all the ambulances, trains, and ships, not to mention the manpower used in transporting a wounded man, could be used for supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements for the troops at the front, it will not appear strange that from a strictly military standpoint, a dead man is sometimes better than a live one if wounded. Not long after the first digging party, our general decided, after a careful tour of inspection of the communication trenches, upon an ideal spot, as he termed it, for a machine gun emplacement. Took his map, made a dot on it, and as he was wont, wrote "Dig here," and the next night we dug. There were 20 in the party, myself included. Armed with picks, shovels, and empty sandbags, We arrived at the ideal spot and started digging. The moon was very bright, but we did not care as we were well out of sight of the German lines. We had gotten about 3 feet down when the fellow next to me, after a mighty stroke with his pick, let go of the handle and pinched his nose with his thumb and forefinger, at the same time letting out the explosion. "Gott strafe me pink and bloody well gassed, not half I ain't." I quickly turned in his direction with an inquiring look, at the same instant reaching for my gas bag. I soon found out what was ailing him. One whiff was enough, and I lost no time in also pinching my nose. The stench was awful. The rest of the digging party dropped their picks and shovels and beat it for the weather side of that solitary pick. The officer came over and inquired why the work had suddenly ceased. Holding our noses, we simply pointed in the direction of the smell. He went over to the pick, immediately clapped his hand over his nose, made an about turn and came back. Just then our captain came along and investigated, but after about a minute said we had better carry on with the digging, that he did not see why we should have stopped as the odor was very faint, but if necessary he would allow us to use our gas helmets while digging. He would stay and see the thing through, but he had to report back at brigade headquarters immediately. We wished that we were captains and also had a date at brigade headquarters. With our gas helmets on, we again attacked that hole, and uncovered the decomposed body of a German. The pick was sticking in his chest. One of the men fainted. I was that one. Upon this, our lieutenant halted proceedings and sent word back to headquarters, and word came back that after we filled in the hole, we could knock it off for the night. This was welcome tidings to us, because next day the general changed the dot on his map, and another emplacement was completed the following night. The odor from a dug-up, decomposed human body has an effect which is hard to describe. It first produces a nauseating feeling which, especially after eating, causes vomiting. This relieves you temporarily, but soon a weakening sensation follows, which leaves you limp as a dish rag. Your spirits are at their lowest ebb, and you feel a sort of hopeless helplessness, and a mad desire to escape it all, to get to the open fields and the perfume of the flowers in Blighty. There is a sharp, prickling sensation in the nostrils, which reminds one of breathing coal gas through a radiator in the floor, and you want to sneeze, but cannot. This was the effect on me, surmounted by a vague horror of the awfulness of the thing, and an ever-recurring reflection that, perhaps I, sooner or later, would be in such a state and be brought to light by the blow of a pick in the hands of some Tommy on a digging party. Several times I have experienced this odor, but never could get used to it. The enervating sensation was always present. It made me hate war, and wonder why such things were countenanced by civilization, and all the spice and glory of the conflict would disappear, leaving the grim reality. But after leaving the spot and filling your lungs with deep breaths of pure fresh air, you forget and once again want to be up and at them. End of chapter.